this picture is taken on this absolutely huge, humongous 20 by 24 Polaroid camera, and there's not very many of them in the world. One of those, it takes like a couple of people to pull the film through. It's a pretty incredible experience. So this is the one exception I have for liking a picture of myself. So Polaroid as a company, it started in 1937, but there wasn't a Polaroid camera until 1948. So Polaroid was started by Edwin Land. And Edwin Land was a Harvard dropout. He was a physics dropout. And he basically was wandering across Times Square one night, and he saw that all of these cars and car headlights were dazzling. And so he thought he was going to come up with a solution for trying to fix the problem. So he invented this thing called the sheet polarizer, which is kind of incredible. And it's what we have on our screens. It's what we have on our iPhone screens. It's what we have on television screens. We use it all the time. And basically, it organizes light into, instead of spreading all over the place, it arranges it in a directional way. And he made this very thin sheet polarizer that we use on almost everything. So the term Polaroid actually only came because they were trying to think, well, what are we going to call this sheet polarizer invention? And so he and a friend of his were chatting about it, and so his friend was an art history teacher at Smith College in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And his friend was like, well, we need to come up with something that's Greek, we need something with some kind of reference. Anyway, it almost ended up being epi-polybol, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, so we might have a very, very different way of referring to Polaroids. But yes, so this is what a sheet polarizer does. So you can see these on pretty much everything, and that's how we organize light rays. So anyway, he did so well with this, it was used on so many applications, and so then he was asked to advise on loads of science-related kind of committees for the government, and he ended up with, almost as many patents as Edison. So he was always patenting things. So he went on holiday to Santa Fe with his daughter and, funnily enough, his patent lawyer. And one day he's taking some pictures with his twin lens reflex camera, and his little daughter, who's there, Jennifer, turned around and said, "But Daddy, why can't I see the picture instantly?" And he went, dunno, actually. That's a really good question. I've never really thought about it. So he went back to the restaurant and then scribbled some ideas on a napkin and kind of handed it over to his patent lawyer, who went, I'll get to work on this right away. And so after not too long, he managed to come up with the first instant photograph. They eventually came up with this way of making 8x10, an 8x10 demo of Polaroid film. And so you can imagine when all of these press photographers, so he presented this to the Optical Society of America, and you can imagine the room was completely packed out to the rafters with people who were all shooting on press cameras, which back then would be like a Graflex. So they had these really clunky, massive cameras. And then all of a sudden, they saw this person just take a picture in front of them and develop it in front of them. And they were all thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to go and file my images, and I'm going to have to go and develop them in a lab, and I'm going to have to go through all of this process. And so you can imagine, it just went wild. This was like a complete miracle. Then the next year, they decided that they were going to make a small format that was actually sellable. So they made, so this is in Jordan Marsh, which is basically Macy's, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so they made these cameras, and so $89.95 was how much this cost, and they made 47 units, and they released it in the end of November, and they thought, in conservative estimate that this camera would sell out by Christmas time, but it was 2 hours, and they sold out all of the units. And it was kind of amazing because, a little random fact about this camera, but it was really, really heavy. It was 2 kilos. And the reason is because you could get away with different tax level, sales tax, if it was over a certain weight, because it would class as professional equipment. So that's what they did. But of course, the film was really, really, really not perfect in the beginning. So in the beginning, it was sepia, and it would be unstable, and it would curl, and it was just really difficult, and it wasn't really what he had in mind. And it was roll film, so you had to pull a series of tabs out. It was very complicated. It was not exactly user-friendly, and loads of people got their pictures wrong. So they invented these stopgap solutions, so things like that on the right-hand side, which is actually a film coater that you had to put onto all of your pictures so they didn't just roll up. And so eventually they managed to make the format into a more digestible and stable form. And so they released the Swinger, which is one of my favorite. This came out in the 60s. Before homosexuality was legalized, for instance, people would be shooting on Polaroid because there was no way of criminalizing a person for developing or dropping off the images. So it was used as a very subversive medium, and it was used, you know, by any kind of group that didn't want to have their pictures being meddled with. So it was a really, it was kind of iconic for that reason. And so, but they had a problem, and it was black and white, it was difficult to use, it was really quite expensive for what it was. And so they were like, oh, we need to do something about color. Like, you know, color TV was coming out, and everyone just wanted color. So they really went through the ringer trying to make color film. So these are all of the chemical compounds that they were trying when they were making color film. It's quite a lot of compounds. So Polaroid is actually one of the most complicated chemical processes because the amount of chemical reactions that have to happen in sequence in like an infinitesimally small amount of time and completely in order, it's so complicated. But yeah, they tried about 5,000 different compounds. But eventually they did manage to bring out color film. And so it was in 1968. And my friend Paul Jan Barber, who sadly passed away earlier this year, designed all of this packaging. And it was designed to compete with Kodak, because Kodak right then had this like bright yellow packaging. It was so iconic. And so then Polaroid like had this. It was also the year that the Polaroid collection started. And so I think we'll probably chat about that a little bit later. But essentially the Polaroid collection, if you don't know about it, was this incredible resource. It was like, basically Edwin Land, who founded it, had this grand goal for Polaroid, that it wasn't going to be like this medium for just going out and taking drunken party shots. That wasn't his vision. His vision was that a Polaroid should be as good as anything else that was on the market. It should be as good as medium format film. It should be as good as 35mm. It should be as good as 5.4. It should be like just as competitive. So the whole idea behind that was that Ansel Adams was contracted by Polaroid to go out into the world, and he would wander around all of the universities and look at graduate shows, and he would accumulate work for the Polaroid collection. He would take it into the lab, and then he'd say, like, we want you to develop film that can compete with this. And he also bought lots of work by different artists all around the world. And so he built up this absolutely huge Polaroid collection. And then later on, they had an artist support program where they would give artists Polaroid film, and in return, part of their work would become part of the Polaroid collection. So when Polaroid eventually went bankrupt, which I'll also come to, that was one of the major assets, and it was all sold off and broken up, which is very, very sad. So when they made peel apart film, which was the most kind of groundbreaking process, I suppose, because it didn't require this like roll system, and so that made it so much easier and more accessible. But this is also the reason why I'm going to tell you this now and etch this on your brains forevermore: don't shake Polaroids. Please do not shake Polaroids. This is my friend Paul, and he designed the iconic Polaroid rainbow, which you see on everything, including my shoes, actually. So because I'm dressed on theme today. So this rainbow is like obviously one of the most recognizable brand marks in the world. Apple kind of copied it, and funnily enough, Steve Jobs always used to quote Edwin Land as being basically his inspiration for how he presented, because he was like a real showman. But you know, so after all of this, Edwin Land, it was like so successful, it was doing so great, but he was not happy about it, because this wasn't like the complete clean system that he wanted. And what was interesting is that Lady Howard Johnson, who was the first lady of the US, she wrote to Edwin Land and she said, you know what, I've got a bit of a problem. And she was working on with the national parks at the time, and she was like, you know what's a disaster is how much rubbish is being created in the national parks from all this Polaroid detritus, because you had to rip away the negative part and pretty much throw it out. So she said, can't you just come up with a bit more of an elegant system? And he went, yeah, maybe. So he started working on this project called SX70, which stands for Special Experiment 70. It was the 70th experiment or 70th thing that they were working on behind the scenes. And even though there don't seem that there were many Polaroid products in this long list, there were tons of other things. You know, he was working on the U-2 spy plane. He was an advisor on Eisenhower's space program. I mean, he was a busy man. So this is what the camera was that came out. And I mean, it's such an incredible piece of design. If you've never held one, you should really go and touch one. They're a beautiful thing. And it was it's an SLR folding camera. It was the first ever SLR that could fold down. And so on the right-hand side, you can kind of see some of the technology that went into that. I mean, like a huge amount of electronics went into this. And he was on the cover of, magazines. It was like such a big deal. Truly, it was kind of magical. And it was the first time as well that you could watch a picture develop in your hand, because even before that point with Polaroid, it was sealed, so it was not visible as it was developing. So this is what we all think of as a Polaroid. And the reason that this was so groundbreaking is because everyone knows that you can't just develop a picture just in light. Right? You need normally to develop a picture in the dark. You go in a dark room, you process it. It's not something that you can just do right then and there with chemicals. So they actually developed this thing called an opacifier, which is the top layer, which basically shields the negative while it's getting busy, and it shields it and allows it to develop in secret. And so that's such a groundbreaking invention. And so this is like the mini darkroom on the go. And basically at the top you have an acid layer and you have alkali that migrates through all of the layers, and it becomes neutralized at the top. And when the acid and the alkali meet, it clears. So actually the picture is often more developed than what you think. You think that it's the picture developing in front of you, but what you're actually watching is the opacification layer clearing. As you see the development process. But most of the film now that you can shoot, which is also what's sort of amazing, and Lady Howard Johnson, Lady Bird Johnson would be very proud, is that we now can have film with rechargeable cameras that doesn't require a massive battery pack, because that was another thing that was a huge bit of waste. So in 1977, they made a consumer version of it, and it became the biggest selling camera in history, and it still holds that record, which is pretty mad. So meanwhile, and as I said, so Polaroid and Kodak, they were pals. But then, they tried to take stuff in-house, and Kodak was like, that camera did really, really well. What are we going to do? So they brought out this, which is called Instamatic. And sometimes people say, Instamatic cameras. I'm like, no, don't confuse Polaroid cameras with Instamatic cameras. They are two very different things. And so it took just 6 days, and Polaroid filed a lawsuit against Kodak, and that really formed the end of their relationship. And what was really funny about this particular part of history is that if you find one of these in a yard sale, don't buy it. There is no way you can get film for it. But what is funny is that if you look at it and you turn it over, each one had a serial number, and it was on a little plate. And a lot of them in yard sales, you'll see the plate has been pinged off, because for a long time, you could get back the entire value of the camera in Kodak stock. So they would trade it at the amount that Kodak stock was worth at the time. So people were making lots of money, and they honored this agreement. So you could make lots of money by basically pinging off the back of it, and then you'd get Kodak stock in exchange. So sometimes people would just go around and ping off the serial numbers off the back of these cameras. So good life hack. Not many out there now, but... So this trial, it just took forever. And so Edwin Land just became so embroiled with the trial that he just took his eye off the ball, basically. And he was there every single day. People were just like, oh my God, you're so obsessed with turning up. And so he just, in a way, that was when the kind of company started to slightly fall apart. It took 75 days of actually in the trial, but yeah. And he never saw it out. He never saw the settlement. But it was at the time, it was the biggest kind of patent settlement in history. So he won in 7 of the 10 patent judgments. And they'd sold already 16.5 million cameras, which is pretty insane. And so there used to be quite a lot of Kodak stock for free floating around in yard sales. And then Polaroid had a completely crazy idea, which is this a video camera. But it wasn't just any video camera. In order to process the film, you also had to have this massive processor which is on the right. So it wasn't exactly portable. And this was actually my friend Paul, who did all the design work. He said this was his last ever design, packaging design, but he really loved this one. This was his favorite packaging design that he had ever done, funnily enough. But so I managed to get him to dig out his original sketch of it somewhere along the line. But this was such a bad idea, but it was technologically incredible, because to create a transparency, something that you could see through in color, so with just going through a projector means you need to have additive color. So normally we have subtractive color, which means that everything is in negative. But because this was a basically playing from this tape inside a video cassette, you had to have it being almost miniature slides in color, which is just a completely impossible idea, and hence why it didn't really work out, because it was a really expensive system, it wasn't portable, there were so many things that went wrong with it. They sold hardly any, and I probably have like 4 of them at home, and they're a thing of beauty, but I can tell you that the reason I've got 4 of them is they were really cheap and they're in perfect condition and the packaging's really sexy, but other than that, they're a brick. The 600 format came out, which is the one that we all think of now. Like, this is, it kind of looks like an SX70, but it develops much faster, so you can shoot it in lower light. Like, it works well with flash. It's like a great all-rounder of a film. But Edwin Land, sadly, he died kind of around the same sort of time as this was all happening, and so he never managed to see that the lawsuit was even settled. So he just lived out his days basically without his company. He'd been pushed out of it and didn't even know that they won the case. And then there were many other weird formats. So there was this craze in Japan for sticker machines, crazy little sticker machines, and people going in teenagers, and so they made an iZone camera, which was pretty similar. It would have these postage-sized Polaroids that you had to physically pull out. There was no kind of whirring noise. The same thing with the Joy-Cam. It was a little bit bigger. This was the last SLR that they ever made, which was a thing of beauty. I loved this camera. This folds down in this really amazing way, and then the film ejects into a back panel. It's really amazing. So in 2008, after 2 owners, the company went bankrupt, and Thomas Petters, who was at the time a bit of a crook and ended up with a 25-year jail sentence, he basically was running Polaroid as a bit of a Ponzi scheme. And so everything, no one knew how in trouble it was. And then overnight, pretty much, it was announced that everything was over. And so the last film that existed for most of the cameras that I've shown you, the last film that you could get was 2009. That would be the most recent film. So I actually still work quite a lot with a lot of old film, and I kind of like the poetic nature of working towards its demise, because I've been preserving it and dealing with it and having to kind of learn as it's dying, which I think is sort of something beautiful about literally working with a medium until it's over. But luckily, if you're shooting, on the kind of 600 cameras, you can use the film that exists now. And so what happened is, so there was a guy, Florian Capps, and he was running a website at the time, which was my favorite place on earth at the time, was basically hanging out on this nerdy website called Polaroid.net. And you could literally see every single picture that was uploaded every day, because there were just not that many. It wasn't like Instagram. So I got to know everyone, and that's how I kind of really embedded myself in the Polaroid scene, is because you would really get to know people on this website. It was a super nerdy place. And I met some of my best friends in the world from there, actually. And Polaroid was run by Florian Capps, and they used to have a sideline, which was called Unsaleable, which was just an online shop, and they would sell a lot of the stuff that they deemed unsaleable. So they'd buy dead stock film, and they were reselling it. And then that became what ended up being the Impossible Project, because it was a group of kind of fanatics, I suppose, that ended up kind of clubbing together to save the medium. And they heard that the last factory, which is in Enschede, was basically going to be shut down and gutted. And so they were no, wait. And they managed to get enough money together to keep it going for a couple of years. But the problem was that all of the economies of scale associated with creating the film, and all of the there were so many companies who were actually providing small little bits of chemical to Polaroid. All of them went out of business. So then they had a problem. They had to reverse engineer it, and they'd made this commitment. They were oh damn, we've got a factory, great. We haven't got any chemistry, so they decided to undertake this Impossible Project, which is where the name Impossible came from, which was an Edwin Land quote: "Don't undertake a project unless it's manifestly important and nearly impossible." And so these are some of my really early test shots. So Type 40 film was the first ever Polaroid film released, and so Impossible used the same naming convention, and so their first film was called Type 40 and Type 43. And these were my first pictures, which, yeah, you can see, not great. And this picture had so much more detail in it, and what would happen is the pacification layer, it wasn't that great. So when the picture would eject from the camera, it was just still exposing, and so you had this fading moment. And so I was pretty much shooting these, and they were just, I was wow, wow, it's working. Oh no, it's gone. And it was like this really like, oh, okay. It was a bit of a rough patch. And so I think for a little while, people thought that the film was dead and that they weren't not very supportive of the company initially, because they were like, oh no, that film doesn't work. And maybe people in photography have been like, oh no, that film doesn't work. Well, things have come on a very, very, very long way. These again were early test shots. And this one on the right is like the first color film, which of course doesn't have that much in the way of color in it. And so, I mean, it was an interesting medium to work with because you had to work around all of its quirks, but you really kind of had to understand, I suppose, like what the ins and outs of Polaroid film, like why was this fading? And so people would come up with all kinds of interesting like ways of hacking it and like gluing things to the front of their cameras to eject into and doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things to control it. So I don't know, it was almost like a community strengthener, because the people that got through that period were like the hardcore diehards, of which I was one. And then, the company ended up morphing into Polaroid Originals, and then now into Polaroid again. And so there was this camera, which is the i1 on the left. So that was the first like new Polaroid camera in basically decades. And then there's a Polaroid Lab, which you can still get, which I love, and I use this all the time. It's a bit of a cheat, though, I must confess. You can print Polaroids effectively from your phone, but it's not a printer because you don't plug it in. It like photographs your phone's screen, which is pretty nifty. And then the film that came out kind of in line with all of these new advancements was this I-type film, which meant that, because you didn't need a battery in the film pack anymore, you could just charge up the cameras, which brings us to the kind of present day, which is the camera that like we're going to be showing later. And so this is kind of leaps and bounds away from like any of the kind of consumer cameras that have existed in such a long time. And this is kind of, it's got all the professional features that you'd expect. So yeah, it's a real life change of a moment. And so because I know some of you are going to be hanging out and doing a workshop, I'm going to give you like a little bit of Polaroid inspiration, because you don't have to be just like really straight-laced about shooting Polaroids. The whole point is you're meant to mess them up. You're meant to hold them. You're meant to touch them, scrunch them, play with them. You're not meant to just like sit there and be precious about it. Like that's not the point, right? So I don't know if many of you know this, but Warhol actually used the Big Shot, which is kind of a brilliant thing. They kind of had a dance they used to call the Big Shot Shuffle, because it only has one fixed focal point. So like to get it, you have to kind of like do this. And so the Big Shot Shuffle was like a bit of a dance. But all of his paintings were pretty much based on Polaroids that he'd shot. And they have this Magicube, this crazy bright flash, which is why they all have this kind of blown out, almost like screen print look already. And they all have such a particular look. You can always tell when something's been shot on a Big Shot camera. Then you've got like Chuck Close. That's the camera that my Polaroid at the beginning. So that Polaroid at the beginning of me was shot on this camera. That's how big it is. Just to give you an idea, it's a little bit intimidating being in front of it, especially when you've got like a couple of people to operate it and it's like a real drama. You're like, please don't blink, please don't blink. So anyway, that's Oprah Winfrey being photographed. And then he also used that to paint from. So he used that as the source for a lot of his painting. And this guy, Lucas Samaras, is one of my favorites because he was really like, I'm going to embrace everything about Polaroid film, and I'm going to cut it up, I'm going to splice it, I'm going to heat it, I'm going to stick it in an oven, I'm just going to see what happens. And so he created some incredible work. But this stuff, the photo transformations, this whole series were made with SX70 film, which at the time you could also like move around and manipulate, which was like super nice. You could just like push the emulsion around. It's hard to do that now. The emulsion is not as malleable, but you can still get some movement out of it. And that's kind of like when I was saying about don't shake the Polaroid. Well, that's because that's like what happens when you push emulsion around. It doesn't stay in one place. And then, of course, I'm just going to give her a name check because there's not many women in this, unfortunately. Patti Smith, who I love and adore. If you wanted to look at like black and white Polaroids, she has several Polaroid books. Mapplethorpe, again, because, I can't mention one without the other. And obviously, this is a Polaroid 250 camera that he's shooting with. And then you've got like people like David Hockney, who did massive composites. And so, these, you've seen this a million times, but you kind of have renewed appreciation of the fact that how many times they had to probably get that person to jump into that pool over and over and over and work out that positioning. There's like a definite art to doing this. So you could even do that later if you wanted. You don't have to just take a single image. And then you've got, of course, it was used in fashion all the time. So like Guy Bourdin, Helmut Newton. I mean, every single photographer that ever shot anything commercially basically used Polaroid. It was like used as a test format. So you'd be shooting it like just to check with your client how it looked. And so many of these actually got thrown in the bin, and some of them are complete masterworks. It's such a travesty. But honestly, it was such a important part of like any commercial job. And Polaroid was used, again, it was like used in medical world. It was used because you could shoot a picture immediately and you could put it in a file. You didn't have to take this, to a lab and process it and then not mix up what patient is what and, file it all correctly. You could just literally just shoot it right then and there. It was used for dentistry. It was used for law enforcement. It was used for insurance purposes because you couldn't fake a Polaroid. Each one had a unique code on the back of it and still does. So there was like so many professional applications. And then on the right-hand side, this is actually Ansel Adams doing tests with SX70 film in Yosemite. And so he wrote all the notes. So he would be given the film, and then he would go away and write all the notes on improvements. And so people think of like, Ansel Adams like the master photographer. He's the one that everyone gets like a real, I was going to say hard on, but I will say that. But that's kind of what people are obsessed about him. And yet Polaroid is often thought of as being this like an amateur medium, but it just shows that actually that's not the case at all. Like he was the person who was really driving so much of the progress and wrote actually the first how-to Polaroid book. So I feel like I'm in good company. And this was like one of his tests, for instance. So it doesn't have the classic border or anything because this is a literal test film. And then you've got like Wim Wenders. And this is like, I mentioned that kind of, I'm putting this in because this was my important point about, the subversive nature of Polaroid. And this is from Casa Susanna, which you should watch. It's a brilliant documentary, and it's an incredible story about a group of cross-dressers that gathered in a place called Casa Susanna. And it was a place, like a safe haven, where they could express themselves and be themselves. And there were not very many places like Casa Susanna. But they, one of them was relatively wealthy and would use a Polaroid camera to document, her friends. And so there's this incredible record because Polaroid existed. And this kind of part of history, like queer history, just simply would not have been documented in the way that it has without Polaroid. Because I think, the queer community's not been terribly well documented historically because of all of the risk factors. And actually, when you see things like this, it's really important and it's really moving to know that there was a record where people were like saying, I exist, and Polaroid allowed that to happen. So I just thought I'd leave you with that thought. Ellen Carey, who is a bit of a legend, anyway, she makes all sorts of different kind of experimental works, but a lot of her like very prolific work is with Polaroid 20x24, and it's cameraless in a sense, like as in she's just using light and light painting on the film itself and doing these pulls. So Polaroid doesn't have to be like this straightforward thing. Like it can be anything you want it to be. I want you to like break it apart and play with it and see how it works, because it's like a physical, tangible, chemical medium. It's not meant to be something that is like sat and treated like a prized jewel. It's something that you should fall in love with. So I'm going to give you like a super brief little bit about me and how I ended up with the Polaroid obsession at all. That's my first ever Polaroid. So start life as you intend to continue with Guinness and Polaroids. Start them young. So I was born in Ireland, and I was there for the first 7 years of my life. And then my dad decided that we were going to go living on this boat, which was not actually as fun as it looks. Don't go living on sailboats. That's my other. Don't shake Polaroids and don't go living on sailboats. Those are my two pieces of advice for you. So we didn't have a lot of money and we didn't have a lot of time in places. And so often taking pictures and getting them developed meant that you had to hang around, right? You'd have to wait for things to get back from a lab. So we just don't really have very many pictures. And I have basically this picture and I have this picture. And so when I started secondary school in the UK, everyone was like, well, I don't believe you, I don't believe that you did all these things because you've got no evidence. So I used to collect objects and things instead. So I'd have like beer mats when someone would put down their drink and it would leave a ring. I would write down the person's name and pretty much how much I liked them on a scale, sliding scale, and the date and where it was. And as I would kind of collect all these things in like scrapbooks instead of, sticking them somewhere, throwing them away. I would like hoard these things. And so I just had all these like pointless collections of stuff. And I'd collect sand from places or just, physical little, everyday detritus. And Polaroid in some ways has like a real similar feel to that because you're collecting something that was born in the place that it was taken in. So each Polaroid bears the marks of its birth in a way that most other mediums just don't. It bears the marks of my touch. It bears the marks of my body heat. If I put one in my pocket and I forget about it and I sit down, it'll bear creases. It'll tell a whole story and a narrative in this particular physical format. So, they're really united in the moment and they're tied to their place of birth. And I think that, the way that I collect them, it is very similar to this kind of accrual of stuff. So my early stuff was shot generally on expired SX70 film. And that film is so beautiful. Sadly, pretty much doesn't work at all now, sadly, because I had a couple of packs in the fridge and I was giving it a go and nada. But, I can see so many parallels to the way that I grew up in these pictures. And so I would photograph people from like super far away. I didn't really shoot close-up pictures at all. So it's kind of ironic now that I shoot mainly portraits because I was a bit afraid of people. And I didn't shoot a lot of people. And so one day someone said to me like, you never really take pictures of people. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's very true. So I decided to do something about it. And that's kind of how I ended up shooting portraits. Is actually because it was a bit of a like, well, screw you. I'm going to do that then because you said that I can't. Fine. That says a lot about my personality. And, so I used to spend a lot of time on the boat, like looking through binoculars from far away. And so you can see all these people, literally small people. And I'm always kind of observing them and never interacting with them. Who knows? The cable, there you go on the right. And this is the camera. This is the SX70 camera, the magic camera again. This one is possibly like one of my biggest seller of pictures, and it's kind of funny because it was like literally a throwaway 2-second moment taken in Margate. And I had a whole series of pictures that were kind of about the British seaside resorts of Margate and Benidorm. And I'd visited Benidorm when I was a kid, and I'd lusted after this idea of Britishness, and I'd really desperately wanted to be like one of those kids. And I kind of had made all this work, and kind of, I suppose like in my subconscious, it was like reliving childhood in a way. And I ended up publishing this book, which is called Dreamlands Wastelands, which was like the first thing I published, and it was in 2014, and it was a real, like it was such a fun experience, and it was published by a small press called Jane and Jeremy that I still work with now, and I do various things with them. But as in the process of making that, I needed a couple of extra shots taken in Margate that were mirroring things that I taken in Benidorm, because the book like flips one way, like one way is Margate and one way is Benidorm, and you have to flip it over, and the one picture is upside down while the other way is the right way up. And so I had these pairs. So I went out looking, and I was like, oh, the film wasn't kind of as streaky or as destroyed, and I was thinking, oh, what should I do to kind of bring that out? So I basically put some toothpaste on the rollers of my camera, and it causes pressure because, every time the rollers are moving to push the picture out of the camera, you get an undulation. And so this repeated pattern is toothpaste, but because it's not completely symmetrical and perfect, because the toothpaste squishes as the time goes on. So I don't recommend you do this with the cameras upstairs, by the way. But with your own, I totally sanction it. And I uploaded this picture to Instagram, and the commissioning editor for photography at Thames and Hudson was like, hey, so that picture that you posted, and it kind of led to me being commissioned to write Polaroid The Missing Manual, which has now been slightly renamed. And then, I was always producing this very tiny work. And then one day I went to a gallery and they were like, tried to show them the work. And they were like, you know what, we love your stuff, but I think you need to make bigger work. And I was like, well, a Polaroid isn't bigger. Like, that's the thing. I liked the intimacy of it. You had one on a wall. One person at a time could view it. But then I was like, okay, well, I'm going to have to make bigger work then. So I started making these Polaroid emulsion lifts, which is basically where you separate the layers of the Polaroid film apart. It's quite an intricate process. You float off the emulsion into water, and it becomes translucent, and it's like a temporary tattoo. So it just floats free, and it's this see-through thing, like a little jellyfish, and you have to recapture it, or what I do is I recapture it with acetate. I flip the acetate over, and then I choose my position for where that is going to be laid. And you have to always think about the transparency and the intersections, and you kind of have to recalibrate your brain to make these because you're doing it in such tiny little parts. But it's a really fun process, and it's something that even though this one is done with pack film, which is that peel apart stuff where you couldn't see the picture in front of you, you can actually do this with the modern film too. It just has an extra stage involved where you have to like clean it up. But yeah, and then that's the result. That's what it ends up looking like. And then this was actually made with Impossible film, which behaves pretty much exactly the same as the film that you can get now. And so that the black outlines are the unexposed part of the chemistry that's hidden underneath the border of the film. So that's what makes that one characteristically different. And so I was just showing these in New York just this last month. And it's kind of fun to get back into like doing something physical again, because I spend so much time, shooting stuff that I would never touch, and actually touching an image and like physically is such like a refreshing place to be in. And I'm just going to tell you like very briefly about this, and then we're going to wrap it up. But so I also use Polaroid quite often in my other projects, and Polaroid has like such a symbolic history. So there is this kind of subversiveness about it. There is also an air of like nostalgia. And it's also very beautiful because it's not super crisp because of all those layers that you have where the dye is diffusing through it. It kind of has this haziness to it, which is so characteristic of Polaroid because of the diffusion of the dye. And so it's very, very kind of romantic. And so when I use it, I now use it quite sparingly, but I use it as a storytelling device. So I'll be using it in this kind of project where, like, for instance, these two images here, like this one's really undeveloped. Like one part of it just didn't come out. And this project is about like a very broken community. So I ended up using those images to kind of talk about that idea of broken community. And I used that other one, which is just to the left of that, which is actually also just quite romantic and pretty, and it's for an island that is not romantic and pretty in any way, but this is the way that people in the outside world see the island. And so I was using it very, very sparingly, trying to capture that idea. And so this island is like a 2 mile by 1 mile lump of rock. I mean, it is absolutely minuscule. It's Britain's last remaining overseas territory in the South Pacific, and it's famous for 2 reasons, one of which is it's the home of the descendants of the Bounty Mutiny. And my dad actually gave me a copy of the Mutiny on the Bounty when he was persuading me to go sailing on the boat. And it's quite a tragic ending to this story, and my story too on the boat, but we'll go into that some other time. And this had been made into so many films. This was like an early film of it, which was in 1956, The Women of Pitcairn Island. Basically, when it comes back on, there's a woman being grabbed and holding a weapon behind her back. But because this island was famous for 2 reasons. It was famous for being the descendants of the Bounty Mutiny, but later it also became famous because there was a high-profile string of child sexual abuse trials that took place there. And so this project talks a little bit about the kind of our collective culpability for encouraging romanticism and ignoring things that are happening in plain sight. So this is kind of how the film was always marketed. It was like mutiny, maiden, South Sea love. But then how do you capture this other spirit of like abuse and destruction and community breakdown when you're looking at a world that's still apparently functioning on the surface? So I use a lot of things like found photography. This was 2 pictures that were stuck together and I peeled them apart and this was the remnants. And then, I was using Polaroid 55, which is on the left and the right, and that has like a real kind of Victorian asylum feel. So these were 2 people that were convicted of multiple rapes, actually, and I photographed them on this particular film. And then the girl in the center is the sort of stand-in person who stands in for all of the women who were abused on this island. And then, this is again like a destroyed image because you can't reveal the victims of child abuse. And then this is one of the very like romantic images, and this is Fletcher Christian's cave, so it's called Christian's Cave, and it's the place I spent most time on the island, where I would like sit up there and just watch this community descend into chaos. And apparently that's what he had done, and he had been the leader of the mutineers that had kind of hatched the plan to overthrow the captain, mutiny, steal the ship, and form this community in the middle of nowhere. And then he had slight regrets about what he'd done, and so he would sit up there in this cave. But this is like shown so many times over. So like on the left there's an etching, which is quite a famous etching, And it was this like romanticism of these like tropical islands that are just out of sight, out of mind, like this utopian vision. And so Polaroid really played into that. And so I kind of use it as a storytelling device. This is the one I was talking about, which is of the broken community. And it was like the rock, and it's like the bedrock was broken. So sometimes, failings can actually come to you and become some of your favorite pictures. Like at the time this came out, it was destroyed, and I was so annoyed. I was just so brokenhearted. Imagine I'm thousands and thousands of miles away from anywhere. You can only get there every 3 months on a supply ship. So there was no getting any other film, and my film was coming out like this. And you can imagine my dismay. And I'd kind of gone there because I was going to do this last blast project with the Polaroid film. And I was doing this because, this was the place we'd never landed in when we were sailing, like we'd never got there. And this felt like bringing my life full circle, and then my film was behaving badly. And so, I became a photographer literally because of this whole drama of the boat, because of not having any memories. All the Polaroids are reproduced in real size when they have a border, because I hate Polaroids that are enlarged with borders. It really bothers me. So, and we also did this thing where every single one of them was printed separately. We spot varnished just on the Polaroid area, and then they were all cut out, and then they were all glued in, tipped in by hand, so they felt three-dimensional, because I really don't like things that feel fake. I use a lot of Polaroid in that, and I'm just going to mention this very quickly, but this is like when the island was disappearing, and I had such a horrible experience on this island. Like, I'm not even going to go into all of the ins and outs of why it was so hideous, but truly, it was one of the worst experiences I've ever been through. And I couldn't wait to leave, and I was amazed that I'd even survived it. I was called the only woman of breeding age, and you can just fill in the blanks from there. And so this was the island disappearing from view. And the funny thing is about shooting a Polaroid is that the Polaroid is like emerging as you're vanishing. So I was actually looking at these Polaroids developing as I was moving away from the island. And so it was almost like clinging on to this memory. And then like literally my last memories are of this like physical object that was physically in the space as I was holding it on the aft deck, watching this island disappear through floods of tears of complete relief, while incidentally being filmed by a film crew that thought I was an islander that was sad to be leaving my home because they got the wrong end of the stick. But, there's something so poetic about the physicality of the Polaroid, and I think that's like the thing that, I think that we should all kind of linger on, is actually, in this day and age, it's really hard to have a format that really unites the kind of moment of joy of the photograph, with the physical place where you can kind of remember, even if it doesn't develop properly, you're like, well, you know what, I had my thumb in it, I sat on that, it isn't perfect. But what's so beautiful about it is that you will remember that that's what you did in that moment, and it will help you to remember the moment whether or not the picture turns out perfectly. And I think we quest so much after perfection, and actually sometimes imperfection is a more beautiful thing to quest after. And so I'm just going to wrap up with this very quickly because you probably know about this, but anyway, I'm going to the moon, a bit random, a bit of a life change, a bit of a change of kilter from going from crying on the back of a boat to being on a rocket ship, but it's not that much of a stretch. I'm pretty good with people's bodily functions in close quarters, and turns out I like to be on metal capsules, so there we go. And I will be taking Polaroid film to space. And there's something kind of nice about this too, which is that Polaroid, as I mentioned casually in passing, but Edwin Land was an advisor on Eisenhower's space program, and that led to like the whole to the moon mission that Kennedy announced. And so there is this kind of circularity to all of this. And I wanted also to work with a format that I could physically shoot in space and bring back. So it's like a relic, that it was actually there. It's not something that is transmitted. It's not zeros and ones. It's something physical that absorbs the place. So I will be shooting Polaroid in space. And so this is our crew. And this is what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be going around the moon and back again. So it's like a whole week-long mission in space. And I'm tasked with making a project that, a bit of no pressure, but the idea of this is that we are meant to translate the experience of going to space for everyone else that can't go. Again, no pressure. So they're working on our rocket right now. It's very big. It's got enough space for like over 100 people, and there's basically going to be 8 of us and a couple of crew, we're hoping. And it's Starship, and it's eventually going to be going to Mars. And so I'm really interested in this idea of utopia and dystopia, as I spoke about. And so there is a bit of a line in this, which I'm particularly interested in, is like, you know, who are the people that we want to take to Mars? Who is humanity 2.0? You know, what does that look like, and who are we choosing? And do they look like me or you, or who do those people look like? Because up until now, space has been the preserve of basically white heterosexual males that come from military background. That's pretty much your little small remit. And now there are some women that get to go to space, yay! But there's never been like an openly queer person going to space, so that's kind of groundbreaking and exciting. And so I'm very keen on, like, you know, the kind of the story behind what that means symbolically to go to space, but also what that means as we kind of cast our eyes forward to the future and think about, you know, colonizing distant planets, and what does that actually look like. And if any of you want to ask me anything that I haven't covered, because I sort of do a bit of a meandering chat rather than like super structured, but this is me. I'm very easy to find. It's just me and just my name. You can find me. And I'm very happy to answer people's questions when I have a minute, when I'm often in an airport lounge jetting between things. And it might take me a minute, but I always get back to everyone eventually. So yeah, thank you very much for coming, and I hope that this takes you on a bit of an adventure, and I'm excited to see what you will make later on, and yeah, thank you.